Greetings everyone and welcome to our first review. My name is Sadaris. I'm doing all the videos on this channel. I'm a lifelong nerd and in real life a nurse and a paramedic. Joining me tonight is Seven Saturn. Introduce yourself.
Hello everyone. In real life I'm a software developer and I'm running a small wiki which is focusing on older games such as Armada, which we are going to talk about in a few moments.
And also with us is the community leader of the Star Trek Armada Discord, President Magikarp. So, who are you?
I am also a lifelong nerd. When I was a child, before I turned 3, Star Trek Voyager premiered, and I watched that with my parents every Sunday on UPN. Not Sunday, every Wednesday on UPN with my parents growing up. So Star Trek has always been kind of an integral part of my life. And now, presently, outside of the gaming community, I am a 27-year-old banker.
Well, as you can see in the background, our first review is about Star Trek Armada from 2000. The game starts shortly after the Dominion War during an upcoming Borg invasion. The single player is 8 hours long and lets you play on the side of the Federation, Klingons, Romulans and Borg. Each faction has similar ships and buildings, but different special powers. So guys, what side do you prefer?
For me personally, I like playing the Federation just because they're always the star of the show. But when it comes to what I prefer playing second to them, it would definitely be the Borg. I love the assimilation mechanics that they have.
Well, it's difficult to pick. I believe this depends on your play style. If you are more like upfront, probably the Borg. If you prefer a more sneaky way, of course, Romulans and Klingons. But Federation is difficult to say why it's so attractive. I believe this has to do with, as Magikarp said, it's the star of the shows, of the Star Trek shows. So you have a certain connection to them. So actually, for me, it's difficult to pick.
Yeah, for me it would also be basically the Federation side because everyone wants to be the hero. But also I really like the Romulans because they are, for me, a little bit different than the other faction with the stealth aspect of the game. I recently started to play again the campaign, and from the campaign aspect, I would say the Borg campaign was the best one. It's basically the first 3 campaigns, the Federation, the Klingons and the Romulans, is basically identical, but as Borg you have to think completely different. You have to assimilate now, and basically you are the bad guy now. So a complete change of your side, of your whole goal. So let's have a closer look maybe on the things you can actually do in the game.
Well, with regards to what you're capable of, on paper, the game likes to reward you for building diverse fleets with multifunctional roles, but in reality, being, the late 90s and strategy at the time being a very, I wouldn't say new, but a very niche genre, that it didn't really have enough of a player base to sort of get the feedback they needed for balancing. So what you can do in the game is build a diverse fleet, but in reality, what every faction winds up doing is it's a race to get to your end game ship and then spam as many of them as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that because, well, you have there's the special weapons of every ship, but aside from that, it's a no-brainer. Do I take a lot of small units which will be picked off one by one, or do I use the big ones? Especially with the Borg, it's a no-brainer. Take the cube. You can even take away the ships of your opponent. I mean, what's the point of doing the assimilator or the sphere? Not really necessary. You only do this if you don't have the resources.
Yeah, the other ships are just side projects basically. You want the main goal, you want the Borg cube, the Sovereign, the Nekvar, and the Derdex.
Oh yeah. I will say one thing though, that at least the first game, Armada, did that much better than the sequel. Where, you still had some ships that definitely had utility, like the Romulans had the Griffin with the sensor jammer that was still really useful for making it harder for enemies to attack more than like the vessels in their immediate area by disabling the sensors. But Armada 2, I don't necessarily think had that kind of balance. So a lot of people prefer Armada, the first one, for the gameplay feel and the emphasis on smaller fleets. And what you'll find, especially as someone who's played back and forth between the two, is that ships in Armada, regardless of how big they are or how small they are much tankier, and it sort of gives a sense of weight to everything you build that I think was lost in later games in the series.
Yeah, definitely. Armada 2, we will discuss on a later date, but I also had the feeling that the balancing was really off in the second part of Armada.
I don't want to take something in advance, but Armada 2 had especially the problem that the factions differ even less. If you look at Armada 1, you have basically the same setup. You have the same kinds of stations, similar ships, with smaller deviations like, well, Klingons and Romulans can cloak, the others cannot. And I believe that the Federation and the Romulans do have artillery kind of units, but basically they are all the same. And in Armada 2, this was even worse. There was even less deviation between the factions.
I guess part of that will be because they had not that much time to develop the game, because it was, not even 12 months after the first part was released?
Yeah, they got Armada 1 and Armada 2 out in pretty quick succession. Although I do find it interesting, specifically the development of the first Star Trek Armada. It was the last game that Activision ever developed in-house before they started buying up studios and having them do the work.
When did you guys buy it? I bought it directly at the release, and basically I have it always on my PC.
For me personally, I actually wound up buying the game twice. Once as its own standalone disc release. I believe I bought it around launch, so I had version 1.0. As we know, the game needed quite a few fixes. Then later on, I bought the Star Trek Action Pack, 4-pack of the Activision titles, which had Armada, Armada 2, Elite Force 1, and its expansion pack all in one 4-CD package. I literally only bought it to get the expansion pack for Elite Force and Armada 2 because I didn't own it yet. But yeah, I wound up personally buying Armada twice.
Well, with me, the story is a little bit more difficult, a little more complicated, because by the time the game was released, I didn't have much money. So actually, I got the game, well, kind of a backup from a friend, if you know what I mean. And it was definitely a game I wanted to have. There are many games where I think, yeah, it's nice, but I don't really want it. It's okay. But in this case, I really wanted to have it, and later at 2003 or something, during that time, I actually bought it. And I think it was really worth the money. But of course, like I said, if you don't have the money, it's a little bit difficult. So if I had had the money, then I would probably have bought it right off during the release.
I mean, there's no shame in nowadays admitting that people have acquired it in less than legitimate means. Just because, I mean, the game released in the year, what was it, 1999 or 2000? It's been, over a decade. And you also have to consider that Activision doesn't even own the Star Trek license anymore, so they're not making any money off of it. So, I mean, I understand that piracy and copyright law is a very sensitive subject, but in this case, I feel that people can kind of get a little bit of leeway if they say, oh, I downloaded it off the internet.
Yeah, I believe I agree on that one. I mean, you can always argue and say, if they want to make money with it, okay, I can understand that. But then they actually would have to pursue this goal. If they don't even try to make new copies of it, sell it somewhere, then, well, who am I cheating of any money? They wouldn't get any anyways.
Yeah, and they don't care. That's the sad part. They have so many great games of the basically golden age of Activision, and they are just sitting there and collecting dust. So why not build up a little bit of hype or let the fans have some fun and then re-release it some later date.
Station complete.
Well, I'm not exactly sure how it is for other Activision published Star Trek titles, but for us, us being the Last Outpost, which is a small Star Trek gaming community, we actually negotiated with CBS and Raven Software about 8 years ago now, where we wanted to release Star Trek Voyager Elite Force HoloMatch as its own standalone client. And Activision at the time, at least from what we gathered, more or less didn't have a say because CBS owned the rights to the game. So there's definitely a possibility that it could be republished in the future, but I'm not sure how that would apply to the first Armada, given that it was actually developed in-house by Activision. So they might have a vested interest in keeping that particular title away from being re-released. Plus, there are some lingering issues with it nowadays, where if you try to play it on a modern computer, you need to install at least 2 different fixes, one to even get it to run on modern Windows and the other to actually get the graphics to work. And even when you go through all that trouble, we personally, myself and another member of the community who goes by Ansi, we have had a lot of trouble getting this to work on VPN clients. It may just be our experience, but Armada would be a very difficult game to re-release today for obviously multiple reasons. But I mean, I'd love to see it. I just don't know whether or not it's feasible.
Which is kind of curious because if I remember that correctly, then the game uses the Microsoft Direct Play. So in principle, it should be adaptable rather easily, because I don't think that they have changed the API or something that fundamentally that you cannot get the game to work properly anymore. And in my personal experience, the single player works just fine.
Oh yeah, it's
But
not
the net playing is a real big issue.
It's not necessarily direct play. I mean, Armada 2 used the same thing, and that works fine. It may just be some older lingering code in the network stack that's preventing it from working, because I know Armada was the last game that had IPX protocol support, and even back in the day when it was functional, I distinctly remember that desynchronization was commonplace.
Yeah.
And people just couldn't stay synced over longer games, so there would have to be a lot of fundamental code cleanup before that game became playable on modern hardware.
Most definitely.
Yeah, but I guess a team like GOG could really do a lot of work, and they proven themselves. They did already so many good classic re-releases without any hiccups. Only some games like Worms 2 has which had some problems with the multiplayer, and they axed the whole multiplayer, so that's sad. But I think with Armada it would be a little bit easier since you have already TCP/IP protocol in place.
Yeah, I imagine it wouldn't be terribly difficult to get it updated for modern systems, but the multiplayer support again would be something that would need to be investigated, because it used a system even older than GameSpy, which, as we know, in the last 6 or 7 years just went extinct. So I imagine that the protocol for that would be a little bit difficult to recreate and maybe re-implement. There definitely have to be some fundamental changes, and I don't know how deep into the code we'd be able to go for that.
I'm not sure if it is really a big issue, because it works over so-called Game Ranger. I'm not sure if you know Game Ranger. And in principle, you can do network play via Game Ranger without the lobby servers of one. You were referring to the World Opponents Network, or in short, ONE. They used it back then, and the network got closed down. So, of course, you cannot use this. But somehow it seems to be technically feasible to do a direct connection. This is probably what the Game Ranger software actually does. So I believe even that wouldn't be a big obstacle.
Yeah, it's definitely doable, but like always, who is paying for it?
Yeah, at the end of the day, the money is really what talks. I mean, I'm sure that CBS is aware that there is demand for the older Star Trek titles to be re-released, especially among the people that bought them. It's just a matter of convincing them that it's financially viable to invest the funds to bring them up to modern standards. Even with the games that got re-released recently on GOG, I know that Star Trek Starfleet Command Gold Edition was left in a state that it won't launch on any Windows more recent than 7, but there is a user-created fix that was just a matter of changing one value that would allow it to work, but they still never went back and patched it.
Okay, that's odd.
Yeah, so I mean, GOG does great work, not to knock them, but there are certain areas where they could definitely use a little bit of improvement.
It's also odd because if you look at games like Far Cry, which also had many different and stupid bugs, they used community fixes to improve the GOG release. So it's odd that they didn't do that with Starfleet Academy.
Yeah, never mind Starfleet Academy. I think the real star of the show would have been Klingon Academy, but
definitely. I love Klingon Academy. For a good reason, it's one of the most viewed videos on my channel. I made a basically 2-hour movie out of the cinematics, and it was amazing. It's a totally different experience than anything we got before and after.
Oh yeah, it was great that they got Christopher Plummer to reprise his role as General Chang. It really gave it that kind of authenticity that the game needed.
This is something I'm also happy about with Armada. I don't know how you felt about it back then, but when I played it the first time, I was really surprised that they actually used the original actor's voiceover. I'm not sure if this has been done a lot in the gaming industry back then, but it was just awesome, cool. You can control the Enterprise, and in the campaign you hear Captain Picard or Locutus or Worf. You can really hear the persons with their own voice. And this is something that you didn't see that often back then, I believe.
Oh yeah, it wasn't super popular to get celebrity voice acting for games in the 90s. I think the Star Trek franchise and their licensed games were some of the first to get their TV personalities to sit down in the recording booth, which it really did help elevate those games and make them feel more authentic to the Star Trek universe. Because, I mean, you could do a text-based game, sure, and I think even dating back to Star Trek Next Generation of Final Unity, they had the voice cast for TNG doing voice work for that, and they were very good about getting the talent to reprise their roles for the licensed products.
First, thanks for getting us back to topic, Saturn. And yeah, I think it's so good that Star Trek did really pioneer the gaming sector in that area, that they included the actors of the original series. And I think the first one was also Star Trek the 25th anniversary, who included the actors. Yeah, let's move on. About our pros of the game in general. We mentioned already actors. The story was also very good for me. I enjoyed it. It fitted into the Star Trek universe. The mission variety was very good, I think. You didn't have to destroy every time all units. Sometimes you just had to escape or infiltrate a prisoner. And it was a real progress behind the story. What did you feel?
Yeah, I felt that the game was narratively pretty sound. I mean, there was everyone kind of gets a little iffy when Star Trek stories start involving time travel, especially nowadays. But at the time, it was very engaging that we were thrown right back into this whole galactic scale, like Borg invasion from the future. And it was a very high stakes story that involved the characters we loved.
Particularly, you also already said it, that the galactic dimension Borg invasion one might argue, well, that's a lame ass idea. We had this, I believe, this twice in TNG and in Voyager, and why bring it up again? But this is what I find interesting about the campaign. They didn't focus too much on that aspect. They had the Klingon story arc, which was, of course, also about the Borg invasion, but not primarily. It showed internal affairs, internal problems. With the Romulans, it's a little bit a different story. They already took a direct approach to the Borg, but in general, it wasn't just only around the Borg invasion. And this is something I found very interesting, and especially the ability that you could play different factions during one mission. I believe also StarCraft did this, that they mixed the factions you can play within one mission, and this spices up the game because you can take the advantages of several different units from different factions and approach the mission problem according to your own agenda. And this is something I really liked. What I also found really awesome back then was the ability to zoom in the game. I mean, Armada is from the gameplay style a two-dimensional game. There is actually a three-dimensional representation, but the game itself is two-dimensional in principle. But you could scroll in, turn the entire map, have a look at every station, every unit from any angle. This is something I found really cool. I mean, it's you must think back. It's year 2000. Yeah, so it wasn't there was any other Star Trek game around which was real-time strategy, and in 3D there was nothing that would be comparable at that time. And you look at the Enterprise or the shipyards, and you just think, wow. I mean, by today's standards, it looks not very interesting, but back then it was just a real wow effect for me to see this thing in 3D. You can have a look from any direction. It's just marvelous. And on top, this is what strikes me also as interesting. You could mod the game rather easily. So there were people doing interesting mods with the game, and you can have a completely different gameplay.
Yeah, the mod community was one of the best things about the Armada series, is especially later on in the second game's life, when we had total conversions like Star Trek Fleet Operations and other mods. I believe there was also a Star Trek versus Star Wars mod for the first Armada that was really popular. They really did bring a whole lot of life to those communities.
Yeah, it was rather easy. I mean, today you sometimes have a feeling that the game development companies actually try to prevent you from modding it in any ways. And this game probably wasn't really intended for modding, but it worked rather well.
Yeah, also I think the developers of the game embraced it later on, especially in the second part. And what I also always got from the game and the things I read about the developers, that they really loved Trek. They tried to make a good Trek experience from the look, the combat feeling, the station and shipbuilding, or little things like including the Omega particle, Sealer, all these little Trek nuggets, which are just amazing for world building feeling. It was basically the first time any franchise had such a game. No Star Wars game, no Stargate game, nothing in comparison.
Yeah, Star Trek was really ahead of the curve compared to other Star Trek sci-fi franchises where they wanted to make their licensed products feel like they were just a natural extension of what had come before.
Definitely, yeah.
I think Star Wars only really got into that by like 2002, 2003, and Battlestar Galactica only recently started doing that.
Okay, now I'm curious. They did... Oh, yeah, of course they did a new game. I completely blacked out now. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I believe it's Battlestar Galactica Deadlock.
Yeah, true. I never played it, but it's already on my Steam list. I just have to install it. It's on my list of shames. Well, let's look at the negative aspect of the game. What I really don't like about the game is the camera. It's so clunky sometimes. The 3D view never really worked for me. Also, I had the feeling that the ships are really interchangeable. If you have a Defiant, basically, you can also have the Bird of Prey from the Klingons. It feels the same. So not that much variation for me. Also, the AI could be a little bit better.
Yeah, some factions definitely did variations of ships better than others, but I think you're right in that at certain points and certain tiers of starships really felt the same in terms of how much damage they were able to do and how much damage they were able to take. Some of those values definitely felt a little copy-paste. I would argue that for me, one of the biggest negatives about Armada is also the camera, but not necessarily in 3D. More that the field of view for actually seeing what's going on is incredibly narrow, which wasn't so much a problem back then when the monitors and hardware acceleration for graphics were generally focused on smaller resolutions and a smaller window of aspect ratio. But nowadays, you look at it and it's just so dated and it's not as intuitive to play as it was back in the day.
There's a trick around this. I personally think they did this on purpose. By default, you are not scrolling very far out. You could do this right in the beginning from every match. You can scroll out a little bit, but even this boundary, as you pointed out, put your overview to certain limits, which by today's standards are just too narrow. But the funny part is there's a variable in one of the plain text configuration files of the game, and there you could change two variables. One is the possible height you can go, because the further you scroll out, the more you see, and the initial value of that. And the funny part is, if you were experimenting with that, then you saw that the engine really was not meant for this, because on a Pentium 3 CPU, the game was really sluggish then. It began to stutter, it became slow, and this is why I think they did this on purpose. They didn't want the computer to have too much to render at the same time. And yeah, this is really something that bugs me too, because as you said, you cannot see a lot of the map this way, and the overview is just too little. And on top of this, I believe the inputs are very problematic. Sometimes you type 3 commands in a row and 2 of them are just not done. So if you compare it with a game like StarCraft, then you think, well, what can be that hard to make a game respond to every key I actually entered? What's the problem? If you compare it, especially with StarCraft, which was, I believe, 2 years older, or at least 1 year older, then you really think this could have this required really some do-over.
I guess they really hit at some points many boundaries they couldn't fix in time, and they had to keep the release date. So they postponed it, and back then patching wasn't that big of a thing. So it basically got lost.
But actually they did patches. I mean, we already talked about it. There was a version 1.0 and there was a 1.1 and 1.2 patch. So they actually did it. And this is something I believe really is missing. The fixing of the netcode, and at least key inputs should work. I don't have to hope that all my commands are actually done. And yeah, this is something from a today's standpoint point of view, you can really think, well, what is this game crappy? Man, they could have done this better. And the problem really is if you know better, if you know a game can be done in a more attractive way. This is what, in a way, messes up the experience. Imagine today you had a game called Armada 1, which is basically the same game, but it simply works out. Even today, this game could be sold, I believe, maybe with better graphics. The game itself is quite nice, but it has some quirks which even by standards back then weren't optimal.
Yeah, definitely. But I really think it would have been a time problem, because they had to make a few patches and already had to work on the next title. Because we mentioned it was nearly 12 months later and they released the second part. So they took a lot of the developers off the project for the second part. So only 2 or 3 people maybe were left.
Which would be crazy even today, I believe.
Yeah, but if you look at games like Call of Duty, who basically drop another title every few months, we would have loved something in the Trek universe like that.
True.
Yeah, there's a lot of people clamoring for a Star Trek game in the vein of something like Mass Effect. But going back to Armada, I feel like when we were just talking about the negatives, that there was one big positive that I felt like we didn't really address, which was that for someone who isn't really familiar with the real-time strategy genre, I feel like Armada is simple enough that anyone can pick up and try it and be decent at it. It's a very accessible game compared to its contemporaries from the time, and I feel it did a really good job of easing someone into the genre.
Yeah, definitely. The whole franchise, it was also doable for somebody who never watched Star Trek but is a fan of RTS games.
Yeah, and especially the game mechanics itself was uncomplicated, to put it in a more positive way. If you compare it with StarCraft, then there's already one big difference. You don't have 2 resources in Armada. You only have one, the dilithium moons. No more. So the only thing you will have to worry about is having more of them, using them more efficiently with more freighters, and that's it. You don't have to think about, well, do I need more Vespene or something like that. You can simply build your economy simply on this one resource and be done with it, and it's okay. And I believe it's also a deliberate design decision to not vary the factions that much. I also believe this is a little bit dull, but on the other hand, if you know one faction, you can easily play the others. While, for example, if you compare it again with StarCraft, someone who plays Terran may have an idea of the game, but put him in a third position when he has never played it before. He's bound to fail with the first missions. And this was never an issue in Armada 1.
Yeah, definitely. Which brings us basically to the next point, what makes the game unique? We already talked about many things, but what I also think is back then it wasn't common that games, better the unit of the games, had special powers. And you had to plan in ahead, what do you want to use, what tactic do you use with these special powers. It was unique for me. And it fitted also in the Star Trek universe, which was also a nice gimmick.
Yeah, I think the most unique thing about the game, about pretty much all of the Activision games from that era really, was that it was a licensed product, like a game that was made for a franchise, but it was done competently, and it was still fun to play, which I feel was really the magic of the Star Trek games of those times, because nowadays you wouldn't look at just a sci-fi or like a quick cash grab license game, and most of the time you just kind of look down on it, but back then it was actually something kind of special.
Well, for me, one definite deviation or what makes it unique is it's the only Star Trek real-time strategy game. I mean, there was Armada 2. Yeah, and there was, I believe, one other title which was round-based strategy game, but real time.
Star Trek Conquest. That one was on the Wii and the PlayStation 2.
So there was another real-time strategy.
Yeah, it was for it was very simplified. It was developed by, I believe, 4J Studios and then published by Bethesda.
Status report.
But it was only for the PlayStation, I assume, because
And
I never had a PlayStation, so this probably has passed me entirely.
Yeah, it was very, very dumbed down compared to what you would consider normal for a normal real-time strategy game.
Engage.
Yeah, I only know it also from some YouTube videos. It didn't look that good and that impressive. But you're right, the only RTS game is Armada, basically. You only have turn-based strategy games like Federation, and that's it for Star Trek, sadly.
Well, officially, sure, but I'd say the fans have done a very good job of picking up where the developers have left off. Like, I'm sure you two are aware of it with Star Trek Fleet Operations, which is a fan-made engine expansion and total conversion of the second game, where it refines and bases itself on the first Star Trek Armada rather than the second. So the resource game is a little simpler, but it's got that weight to it where different fleet composition is sort of incentivized. I basically feel that Fleet Operations is the vision of what the first Star Trek Armada was trying to be.
Oh yeah, definitely. I could totally underline that. It's the best mod, basically. The second best mod for me would also be Star Trek Armada 3 for Sins of a Solar Empire. And also we have to mention Star Trek New Horizons for Stellaris, which is also amazing.
Yeah, those are very, very well done.
But that's basically the problem, as we already talked about, that there is currently no company which addresses the need of the players. If you look at the Armada 3 mod for Sins, then you can, of course, say, yeah, it's practically the same game as Sins, just with a Armada skin. But then again, it is actually an entire strategy game, real-time strategy game, based in the Star Trek universe, and improving on the current situation of Armada 1 and 2. I believe the idea, the decision to use the Sins engine and to build up Trek on it is just sound. And I believe a company could do this probably at least as good, probably better, but no one really cares about it. Although I'm pretty sure, as the modders show, there is a market for it. There is a demand for it, and it is not fulfilled. This is the sad part.
I would love to see Stardock take on the Star Trek license and do a real-time strategy game.
Oh yeah. Because
like
they really have a hand on. They have a hand for the big aspect of the game. I mean, if you look at Armada 1, there's one thing that I think makes it a little bit dull, because the maps are rather limited. If you look at Fleet Ops, there are small maps and really huge maps, and if you look at Sins, it takes us to a whole new level. If you look at a map with 80 planets or something like that, it increases the sheer size of the game, of the gameplay. And this is something Armada 1 definitely was missing. It's a rather limited environment, kind of. And if you scale this up a bit, which isn't too uncommon today, then I definitely would say that Stardock could do this. They have a hand for this.
Yeah, especially they already did a really good work with Armada 1 and 2. And later on, they also did some work on Star Trek Legacy. Star Trek Legacy. But also had a problem with the time aspect.
Oh, Star Trek Legacy. That game. I mean, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but I'm glad that game is dead.
Yeah, I can understand why. I really can, because I was also very disappointed back then. I came basically from this great game Bridge Commander, which had this amazing experience of being a Starfleet captain, to the dumbed down version of Legacy. But I played it many months ago again, and I really enjoyed the story and the modding aspect again. They continued the path of let the community help us a little bit, basically. And they did amazing stuff with the mods. You really have to give it a second look.
Yeah, I mean, I've played Ultimate Universe, and I feel that they did a very decent job of adding more content to the game. But there is a very popular American saying, which is that you can polish a turd, but it's still a turd. True.
Well, I guess we have basically done everything with the point, what could a sequel do better? Maybe only I mention just quickly that they removed the group limit. I always thought it was a dumb idea to only have 8 units per group.
Yeah, and the AI definitely needs some work up too. I mean, actually what the AI really does when it's playing is it cheats. If you go to a normal level, then okay, AI has the same situation as you have. Units are produced in the same amount of time, they take the same amount of resources. But already in normal AI cheats because it doesn't give a damn about the tech tree. You can see this when the AI is building freighters before it even has a mining station. This is something the AI always does. And then on top, if you increase the difficulty level, apparently the amount of time that is required to build units is reduced consecutively. And actually AI is downright stupid. It does nothing fancy, it just throws its ships at you and that's it. And if you can produce units faster and I suspect also cheaper, well, yeah, of course it's more difficult, but there is no, well, there is no glory in that kind of. And AI that actually does smart things, like the StarCraft AI, for example, it knows how to counter certain moves. If you had something like that in a new Armada game, this would also spice up the game, because in my experience, you knew exactly how to treat the AI at a certain point. You knew what it does, you know what it does not, and you could simply build around these obstacles.
Yeah, definitely true.
Yeah, Armada's simple gameplay and simple AI kind of hamper its replayability as a single-player game. I feel like it shines the best in multiplayer, but again, it's just such a pain to get it to work nowadays that it's and it's already such a niche game. I feel like you'd have a little bit of trouble finding a decent-sized audience to play games with.
Or to get them the game, for that matter.
That's basically the reason why we also do this review series now. We want to get a little bit of life back into the old good Star Trek games. And many other old games which don't have any population.
Which is a very laudable goal, yeah. I'd love to see people playing these older games again.
Yeah,
most definitely. And this is kind of what my wiki is all about. When I started this, it was actually for LAN play, because if you're playing with your friends at home, and it's always the same problem, how to set up the game properly. And especially Armada and really old games have certain quirks, certain problems that make them difficult to actually get to run. And this was the whole idea behind the wiki, and I would love to see people share more information on how to get games run, because a game like Armada is worth the effort. It's a lovely game, and the worst part about it actually is if you cannot play it at all, because by some problem you're prevented from playing it.
Yeah, definitely. Also, another big problem we already mentioned, you can't buy it. You only can buy it at eBay, maybe on an Amazon market or a street market, but that's it.
Oh yeah, speaking of which, so you know how I mentioned that Star Trek action pack with the Elite Force and the 2 Armadas and the expansion pack? I looked that up on Amazon out of curiosity the other day. That used is selling for $200.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Collector's price.
which I had no idea it would be at the time.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that the same goes for Elite Force 2. It's very similar. The game was shut down rather early after release, and it's the very same thing. If you want to have a genuine, original Elite Force 2 DVD or CDs, then, well, you have to really take your wallet out.
I guess basically it's the same problem as with Bridge Commander. The urban legend says that there are only 2,000 to 5,000 copies of Bridge Commander out there because it was so shortly shut down after the release that they couldn't make any more copies.
Which is kind of crazy from my point of view. I mean, we already had this piracy discussion a few minutes ago. And, well, if you look at this situation, there is a game that is fully functional, that can be sold. I mean, not today, but back then it can still be sold. But someone decided, well, let's not sell all that work, all that effort, all that money that went into the project. Someone prevents the game from actually paying off. And this is something I cannot understand. From a purely economic point of view, this is crazy. You have put a lot of effort into it, financially, and then the outcome for you is actually negative, and I cannot understand that. Why someone would decide, well, let's not even press new DVDs and sell them. I cannot understand that.
I guess nobody can.
Especially with the disc image so commonly available nowadays.
Yeah, that's pretty much the only way how you can circumvent this problem. I mean, if you really want to play this game, you are either paying a lot of money and not, also have to invest a lot of time, because it's not like it's up for sale every week. And yeah, of course you will try to get it in any other way that is feasible.
I think the worst part about the situation is definitely navigating the minefield that is piracy and the conversation surrounding it. Because, I mean, there's nothing stopping CBS, in theory, from going after the people that acquire it in less than legal means. But it's like players who want to experience this nowadays really don't have a choice. And video game preservation is absolutely like a huge discussion to be had with these older titles. It's just
there's also the cultural aspect about it. I mean, in a way, it is a piece of art. There is a lot of artwork in it, and not just a technical aspect to it, and not just something, well, let's make money from it, but there's also this cultural aspect, and the game just vanishes. So actually, it's not just the game that vanishes, it's also the cultural aspect that is erased, kind of. And in Germany, we have initiatives that at least require to give one copy to an archiving institute, and okay, then it's lying there in an archive. All right, but actually, from a cultural point, that's not really a big win, because, well, no one will experience it anyways, and the experience, the cultural aspect, is gone as well.
Yeah, so I mean, if it weren't for fans keeping these older titles alive, then they really would be lost to time.
Also, not only the game itself is lost, also the information about the game. Saturn and I discussed this many times. The real problem today is also you can't find any information about the ships, the multiplayer aspect, anything. The only thing you can maybe find are some old mods, some old forum posts, or maybe, if you're lucky, a fix for Windows 10. That's it.
And in case of Armada, this is a rather easy aspect in principle, if you leave out getting it to run in the first place. But if you look at titles like Elite Force, which have, from a technical point of view, a lot that you can know, a lot that you can set up and configure, then if you don't know it is based on Quake 3 engine, then you will probably have no starting point of where to get that kind of information. How can I solve, well, let's take a high ping or something like that. The information at one point in time was present on the internet, but over time all those pages vanish, and at a certain point it's really difficult to get any information that might help solve problems with the game, or that just explains certain aspects about it, how certain game mechanics actually are supposed to work. You have no information about this, and so the game is actually kind of fading away altogether. This is something I find rather sad because, as I said, someone put in a lot of effort, ideas, artwork, and of course also money, and after a certain point of time, it's like the game almost never existed.
Yeah, and many crappier titles from this era of gaming is still around, and without a problem you can buy it now. Well, let's move on to the next point. What are your special memories of the game? Do you have any?
For me, I didn't really do so much in the way of online multiplayer. I was a bit too young at the time, but for local multiplayer or local instant action, the campaign was absolutely a highlight for me. But my first moment that I remember feeling like this game was like so special was when I had played as the Borg for the first time, and I had researched the cube up to the holding beam and assimilated all of my opponents. That was very fun.
Well, for me, it's more a feeling thing. I already said, yeah, it was a wow effect when I was zooming in, having a look at the ships, at the stations. But the really cool memory actually is, I believe it was 2001, winter 2001. I was on Christmas holidays, so I had a lot of time as a student back then. Everything outside is white, it's cold, and you're sitting in your cozy room, having the heater on and having something nice to drink, standing right beside me and just playing the game, having a lot of fun. And certain situations are kind of burned into my brain that I can really recall as if it were yesterday. The first Klingon missions. The first Klingon mission was against the Borg, and how that felt. That feeling going into a mission of an opponent you know actually nothing about, because I haven't played the game up and down like I have done today. Today I know any aspect, but this feeling, having a nice cozy situation, just having fun with a game that looks awesome and is placed in one of my favorite universes, the Star Trek universe. This was just awesome, and I believe I never really had something like that again. But of course, this could also be caused because I was that younger at the time, so I haven't had that many experiences. So maybe this was just a lucky situation for the game to give me this kind of feelings.
So now I have to let out the inner nerd of me. I also spent my holidays playing this game in 2000, but it wasn't winter, it was Eastern. It was very nice weather. It was amazingly to spend the time outside, and I just geeked inside, played the game the whole time. And as you said, it was amazing. The first mission as Worf, for example, you have to get away from the Klingons which are hunting you. And you have to escape through the different wormholes, capture a base. It was amazing, the feeling. Also, the modding aspect, as we mentioned already. The first time I saw Deep Space Nine in the Millennium mod. Unbelievable, just unbelievable. Or the many battles between Star Wars and Star Trek. And of course the desync parties we had on LAN parties, which were amazing.
Oh yeah. This is on a bad note. This is also something that burned itself into my brain when we had one of our early LAN parties. We were not very experienced, and then you have a game like Armada, which has a tendency to go out of sync by no reason at all. I mean, you have 100 megabits transfer rate, and it's via a switch, so there is practical no delay time, and still the game somehow gets out of sync, and you're just frustrated and think, well, such a good game, but then you want to try and share the experience with your friends, then you fail miserably without having any chance of doing anything about it.
Yeah, true. I can so good also remember that I wanted to show my friends Deep Space Nine in Star Trek Armada. And I could never show them in multiplayer the station because it always desynced before I could build it. I was so furious. So, on the funny side, do you know of any Easter eggs?
I actually haven't really looked into anything beyond the codes that you can enter in single player, like show me the money to give yourself 2,000 free dilithium. But I don't know about any events or anything you can trigger that cause something funny to happen.
No, sadly it's not in the game, but it's outside. If you look at the video files, you can see a developer with Worf's voice talking about basically the mission situation. It's just 10 to 15 seconds long, but it's very funny. For that you sadly have to download the red tool to watch the pink video, but it's okay.
The only thing I remember is this white cube with the red text on it. I don't recall what it said, but if you were building a station, or if your opponent was building a station and it wasn't complete by the time you left the area, then the fog of war would of course turn the area into not visible, but sometimes there was a white cube in the place of this station that was being built. And this is something I find interesting, because why did they use a white cube with some red letters on it as a replacement? I don't know if this is intended to be some kind of Easter egg, because it doesn't happen always. It just sometimes happens, but it does.
I really don't think it's an Easter egg, because
It's probably a bug.
yeah, kind of. I remember back then when I installed different mods, sometimes they had problems with the textures. Textures. Yeah, and you also had this box sometime when the ship wasn't rendered correctly, or what the hell? What was the reason? You had a box. It shot just ordinary phasers, torpedoes, whatever, but it was a box.
So maybe not an Easter egg, but kind of a bug.
You can count it as a feature. In modern times, something like that would be called a feature.
Yeah, and of course there were those aspects that probably come from the game engine's mechanics. You already talked about the Worf mission where you have to escape the Klingons hunting you down, and you have to get to a certain wormhole. But I believe it's a problem of the game engine that you cannot have one wormhole alone. You always have a pair of them. One where you enter and where you exit another one. And there was another wormhole in the south of the map as well. So you could go through the south wormhole and then right away go through the northern one, and you were done. So you didn't have to move Worf around the entire map for that. And it's a small parts that, well, probably just come from the game engine, but it's funny to know, yeah, okay, this is what the game designer had intended, but I can do it another way.
Oh yeah, there was. It's funny that you bring this up. We found out through testing and with the map editor that you can actually place wormholes without a corresponding pair, but it breaks the AI and then becomes suicidal.
Meaning the ship is torn apart, or what is happening?
No, so what happens is when you enter the wormhole that has no corresponding exit, the ship that goes into it is just completely removed from the game. And
So it ends up nowhere.
Yeah, so what happened was when we were playing with AI on this map that we were testing, the AI would always go for the wormhole that did not have an endpoint and just fly into it and erase whole fleets.
Oh yeah.
Well,
I can imagine that.
That's canon, basically, I would say. Cisco also did this in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah. This is how the Dominion fleet vanished. Ah.
Yeah. Just an Easter egg.
It makes me kind of wish that there was a little more flexibility in the wormhole mechanics and other things that I wish they had the chance to do with the engine. Like if you could do a wormhole that had a random endpoint out of like 2, maybe 3, even 4 different wormholes to let you really get creative with map design for single and multiplayer.
Yeah. And it was always interesting what game mechanics arose just simply by using certain settings. For example, if you remove the fog of war entirely, so you can see the entire map during a multiplayer game, you can always see every ship, also the cloaked ones. And this is why I believe the AI also cheats when it comes to visibility. I don't know if you have ever noticed this, but if the AI does not have decloaking sensors, Tachyon Grid, I believe it's called Tachyon Grid, then it still follows your ships, although it cannot possibly see them if it were not cheating. And you can have the same situation if you remove the fog of war, then you also see every ship, but you cannot attack them. And funny part is, you still can beam in.
Okay.
I feel like that was a design oversight.
Yeah, I also think that's a bug.
Most certainly, but it leads to strange situations when you can actually monitor the AI cheating, because it is following you around, it cannot see you, but magically its units always follow you.
But I guess that's, how to say it, it was the time back then the AIs was always kind of stupid and cheating a lot. I think they couldn't do anything better back then.
Well, I'm not quite sure about this. I mean, again, if you take StarCraft as a comparison,
true,
which has a rather decent AI, and I think you are just right about the assumption that it has to do with the time, the amount of time they had to develop and implement all those features.
Yeah. Good. I would say let's get to the last point of the list. Yeah, tell us basically about your Armada Discord. How came it into life?
So what happened was there was a Star Trek Armada subreddit on Reddit that was not active and hadn't been for a long time. So what I did was I spoke to the guy who owned the subreddit, who kind of forgot that he actually owned it. And I was like, hey, can you like make me a moderator with some permissions to edit the CSS and kind of spruce the place up a little bit? And so then from there, I also had the idea of making a Discord for the subreddit, which it's our Star Trek Armada on Reddit. It's not terribly active at the moment just because we don't have a whole lot of people that are aware of it or using it to discuss the game. But my hope is that over time we'll be able to develop it into a community where people who are enthusiastic and interested in the Armada series, whether it be the official titles or fleet operations or even the Sins of a Solar Empire mod, that we'll be able to get together and sort of breathe some life back into this community.
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea. I also think basically every Star Trek game with multiplayer aspect should have a Discord. And I guess we as the community have to make more propaganda about this, make lists about the different Discords, because you can't find them, maybe include them in some wikis. Yeah, have to make some advertisement.
I believe this is the important part, to get people to know, or at least know where to look them up. If I had to search for a Discord, let's say Klingon Academy, I don't know if there is any, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't know where to look. I have no clue. And the Discord internal search, I believe, isn't very good at this.
Yeah, that's why my hope, because I mean, let's be real here, sites like Reddit are absolutely enormous and attract people of all kinds of walks of life and different interests, and there's a very large Star Trek community on Reddit that I feel would benefit from having an extension for like a hub where they can all go together and like play the games together and sort of relive those nostalgic moments from years past.
Yeah, definitely. The sad part only with Reddit is you really have the problem that the people don't find you. If you are posting something and the first 100 or 200 viewers don't like gaming, the post will get dropped and the more important posts get upvoted.
Yeah, and building a new community on Reddit is exceptionally difficult as someone who is attempting to do so now.
Yeah, I totally understand that. You already know about the Star Trek Games Reddit, which is basically dead. I guess I'm the only one who always watches the activity there, and I'm the first one often who writes when somebody has a problem with the Star Trek game.
Well, the question is then, is it a problem of the platform or the interest of the people? I'm not sure which really strikes here, but you pointed out if it is easy to downvote a important post, okay, this is really a problem then. That's a problem of the platform.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's why we do this video, and I would say that's good for today. We discussed a lot.
Yeah, indeed.
If you see this later on YouTube, just leave us a comment, tell us what you think about the game, about this project we have, and yeah, well, maybe see you next time. Bye.
But then, of course, play the game.
Yeah,
Also
that too.
play the game and join all our Discords, which will be in the descriptions. Until next time, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.